invention of a toy line. Where does it come from? I'm Scott ToyGuru Neitlich. I was the brand manager for Masters of the Universe for about 10 years at Mattel, which is kind of funny because that's almost like a quarter, 25% of its entire lifespan. And one of the things that gets debated a lot online is who invented He-Man? Where did he come from? I mean, lots of people in pop culture are familiar with the Filmation show and the hit Mattel toy line from the 80s and the collector line from the last 15 years, the classics line. And there's a lot of folks who worked on the line back in the 80s who, talk about being the inventor of He-Man. And even Netflix did a entire episode of The Toys That Made Us that was kind of dedicated to this and trying to unearth the answer to the mystery of who invented He-Man? Who invented Masters of the Universe? Well, from my perspective and from working on the brand for, 10 years plus, I can definitely provide a little insight, especially to the collaborative nature of the toy making process. Much like movies, toy making is collaborative. It is different people coming together. Sure, George Lucas, quote unquote, invented Star Wars, but he had a lot of help on those first few movies from, costume designers and, set decorators and special effects wizards. It wasn't just George Lucas. Yes, he was a major, idea man, but he had help. So let's look at some of the people who were huge contributors to Masters of the Universe. I want to start with Mark Taylor. So Mark Taylor is one of the people that was featured in that Netflix documentary, and he talks a lot about the early work he did on the line. He was a Mattel artist. He specifically created something called the Well of Souls, which, yes, you can see that was kind of a prototypical or prototype of what became Castle Grayskull. He also had a concept that predated Masters called Turok, Hero of Prehistory. And you can even kind of see a little like proto-Skeletor there in the background. And yes, so he definitely had ideas of doing a barbarian-based fantasy based on his love for, Frazetta paintings and Conan the Barbarian and that kind of stuff. Which, by the way, let me actually put that one to bed as well real quick. A lot of people talk about Conan the Barbarian and how Mattel was looking at doing a figure line based on the original Arnold Schwarzenegger film. That was completely separate from the work that people like Sweet and Taylor and the others I'm going to talk about on this video worked on what became Masters of the Universe. It's kind of like how, the left hand and the right hand not knowing what each other were doing. There was one group, Mattel Licensing, that was looking at Conan the Barbarian as a potential toy line. There was a completely separate group on a different floor of a different building developing what became Masters of the Universe. They were literally separated within the company, and they did not know what each other were doing. So the idea that He-Man was just Conan rebranded is completely false. Yes, Mattel was looking at Conan, but independently, people like Mark Taylor were developing a barbarian-based fantasy adventure, absolutely influenced by Conan, but without knowledge that, on a different floor, a different department was actually looking at Conan. So that's just one of those kind of funny coincidences in time, and is absolutely not, literally where Conan was just rebranded as He-Man. Mark Taylor was doing a lot of cool sketches of barbarian and, monstery barbarian characters. And some of this was done, way earlier, than when, Masters was being developed in the late 70s. And, he then, became the artist who once what became, was going to become He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Once it got the green light, he was the artist who brought a lot of this to life. And, his love for things like Conan and, Frazetta paintings absolutely pops in his art and is what helped really create the look of what became Masters of the Universe. And, Mark should absolutely be credited for visually coming up with so much of the look and feel of the whole world, of what's, now called world building. Absolutely. If you were going to, have a bucket of people who contributed to the creation of Masters of the Universe, Mark Taylor is a huge part of that. But he was not the only person. His ideas alone were not masters. So let's look at another one of the big names, Roger Sweet, who created the infamous He-Man trio. Now, a big thing Roger contributed, first and foremost, is he came up with the name He-Man. There's actually a photo of this in the San Diego Comic-Con art book. You can see his original list of names, and He-Man is right there. So no question about that. Roger Sweet named the main character He-Man. So he actually laid a lot of this out in a book he wrote almost 15 years ago called Mastering the Universe, He-Man and the Rise and Fall of a Billion-Dollar Idea. Definitely worth checking out. You should pick it up, especially if you're a Masters of the Universe fan, because it's some really good insight not only into the origins of Masters of the Universe, but also what it was like working in the toy industry in the 80s, which honestly wasn't that different from when I was at Mattel 30 years later. So another thing that Roger Sweet contributed was the original sort of pitch of making a hugely muscled character that was literally made of muscle. He took a Mattel Big Jim toy. Big Jim was Mattel's premier action figure line from the 70s, and he basically covered the figure in what's called Super Sculpey. And he talks about this in his book. I mean, I'm literally almost practically quoting directly from his book at this point. So, yeah, he took 3 Big Jim figures and covered them in Sculpey to kind of muscle them up and turn them into what became the He-Man trio prototype. Now, Roger Sweet's idea was that He-Man was going to be like a male Barbie. He could do anything. He could be space, barbarian, military, dress as anything he wanted. And we even made an homage to this trio in a Comic-Con release in the Classics line. But again, much like Mark Taylor, who had those barbarian drawings and the Well of Souls, Roger Sweet's concepts alone were not Masters of the Universe. It took the combination of not just both, there's going to be other factors coming up, but both coming together to create what really is the brand. One of them by itself is not Masters of the Universe. So, essentially, the barbarian look from Sweet's trio was the one picked by management as the theme to explore for a new line. They really liked the barbarian look. It just so happened that Mark Taylor independently was working on a barbarian line, or at least he had the ideas for a barbarian-themed fantasy adventure. So essentially, Sweet got management to approve, based on his 3 prototypes, these ones, to go forward with a barbarian-themed adventure. And that open door that Sweet created and contributed the name He-Man opened the door for Mark Taylor to say, hey, I have these great designs for barbarian images, which would work great now that management is aligned to do a barbarian toy line. And, I've also heard that Sweet brought some of Mark Taylor's drawings to his pitch, whether or not Mark knew about that or not. But the point is, those 3 figures, what was Sweet's idea to do barbarian, space, or military, management saw those and said, we like the barbarian version. Really like the idea of a super buffed up hero, but as a theme, we don't like the idea of, a male Barbie. We wanted to go with barbarian. So Sweet opened that door, and then Taylor filled it in with existing art he had and new art. All right. So switching gears to a third major contributor is Don Glut. So Don Glut is a filmmaker, writer, pop culture, dinosaur lover, and he well known as the author of the Empire Strikes Back novelization. I don't know why I picked the French version. I actually am learning French myself. Maybe that's why. He was very subconscious. But yeah, so Don Glut, big sci-fi writer, big world builder, really creative talent. So he was hired by Mattel as a work for hire. And it's funny, he laid all this out on his website years ago in an interview. And he talks about how he was brought in to specifically pen 4 mini comics for what became the Masters of the Universe line, because Mattel needed kind of a story to go with these barbarian images and all of these crazy cool designs, but they didn't have really names. They didn't have, I mean, other they had He-Man, and they even had D-Man, who was going to be the villain, and they had, Merman, or they even were calling him Seaman at first, until I think they realized that that sounded terrible and changed it to Merman. So Glute was brought on to do these four mini comics, and he knew he wasn't even going to get byline credit for them. He was creating all of these additional elements that became part of the Motu lore. I mean, some of them got dropped actually pretty quickly, like the idea of Skeletor being a demon from another dimension, or the fact that He-Man got his armor from the Green Goddess, which included a invisible force field. So things like this mini comic, The Battle in the Clouds, because he wasn't going to get byline credit and it was all work for hire, he decided to basically throw in a lot of his personal in-jokes or personal things that would kind of like call back to him. So Battle in the Clouds was a reference to an old serial that he personally really liked. Characters like Teela, he named Teela, but the name that he came up with was taken directly from a childhood show that he really loved that featured an elephant named Teela. And he decided he would give that name to the barbarian female character in the line. So this is actually a picture of Teela the elephant from the show. It was actually a real elephant. It was live action. It was called Gunga the Elephant Boy. So Gunga, what you saw there, was the kid, and Teela was the elephant. And they also had some comic book adventures, and they went through India. It's kind of a very sort of Edgar Rice Burroughs type of adventures, Tarzan-y, if you will. But yeah, I mean, it was Teela the elephant, and that's one of the ways, since he wasn't going to get any credit, it was work for hire, and he was going to have to walk away, that this was his way of kind of getting his signature onto the line. Another way was he named Castle Grayskull because his girlfriend at the time was Linda Gray. So again, another way that he could sort of get his name on the line without without a byline. And then finally, he named Eternia, which he thought, it's an eternal place of tons of adventure, so hey, Eternia. And that was how it got its name. So much like a river, like the Nile, where you have the White Nile and the Blue Nile that have different sources and they converge to become the true Nile at Khartoum. Yes, go look at your African maps and history. Lots of ideas came together to become masters. Another key one was Jack Kirby. So prior to working on Masters, Mattel, in their search for a new boys action adventure property that could compete with Star Wars and replace Big Jim, they were looking heavily at doing a New Gods line based on Jack Kirby's work at DC. And you can check out my video that I did just on this, but even though the line didn't go forward, you can absolutely see from the designs, from the characters, from their armor, from the colors, so much of the work that went into this pitch and this pre-work for a potential line wound up in Masters. Ironically, Mattel years later would go on with the DC Universe Classics line, which I also had the privilege and honor of brand managing for most of the chunk of it, did do a lot of New Gods characters. Actually brought them to life under the Mattel banner. But back in the mid to late 70s, Mattel spent a lot of time developing a New Gods line, and all of that work, whether it was prototypes sitting around or artwork or just, the hours spent analyzing this and looking at this artwork, well, you can see, it definitely seeped into the minds of the designers at Mattel. And things that they were looking at and staring at and basing toy concepts off of for, the better part of, 1 to 3 years, absolutely seeped into Masters of the Universe. I mean, there's no question about it. There are lots of New Gods references and design parallels. Again, you could check out the video that I did just on that. All right. And another huge influence was, again, that Big Jim line. So beyond the fact that Big Jim was Mattel's flagship boys adventure line in the 70s, there are a lot of characters and especially a lot of action features that were created for the Big Jim line that were then carried forward into the Masters of the Universe line. Again, I did a whole video just on the connections between Big Jim and Motu, but, between the skull-faced pirate to Iron Jaw, who had removable, attachable hand attachments, attachable hand attachments. That's a good word, Scott. Just look at that face and that Iron Jaw. You can clearly see the influence this character had on Trapjaw. And again, these figures are around Mattel and designers are working on them, so these concepts are fresh in their mind. And it's, if it worked on one toy line, why not work it into another one? You can absolutely see the influence. But we're not done with our journey yet. So, you had the combination of a lot of things. You had, what was previously worked on at Mattel, be it the New Gods line, Big Jim. You had what Sweet and Taylor did. But none of those alone were Masters of the Universe. It took a lot more. Even what Don Glut added to it, creating things like, naming Teela, Eternia, and Castle Grayskull. When DC Comics was brought on board right after the launch to flesh out Motu and write additional mini-comics after the 4 that Glut wrote, well, they created things like Prince Adam and the idea that He-Man had a secret identity. Just like Superman running into a telephone booth to change, so He-Man ran into a cave, or Adam ran into a cave and came out as He-Man. It was kind of an Eternia version of a phone booth, I guess. Then, of course, you cannot discount all of the contributions that Filmation made to the Motu brand. So previous to Filmation, essentially you had Prince Adam running into a cave to become He-Man, which was brought on, from all of the other influences. But then Filmation comes along and introduces major concepts. You had everything from characters like the Sorceress to Orko, who is credited as comedy relief for the show. Orko did not exist until Filmation came along. Or, his iconic transformation and saying, by the power of Grayskull, I am, He-Man. That came from Filmation. That is a major part of the brand. So you have all of these things coming together from different creators to in totality become Masters of the Universe. So, all right, I know I've walked you through a bit of a journey. In conclusion, kind of looking at all of this, it's a melting pot. There is absolutely no one person that created Masters of the Universe. It took tons of people putting their ideas together, some willingly, some not willingly, but everyone contributed major parts. And any one creator's part looked at, isolated by itself, is not Masters of the Universe. There was, if you will, no all-father. There was no, one person overseeing it that, created this character. And you could say, yep, that is He-Man, that is Masters of the Universe, and this guy made it. The way like Todd McFarlane made Spawn, if you will. That's a good example of one guy making one character. So lots of ideas adding up. Lots of brain power spilling over together, some voluntarily, some involuntarily. Yes, I know there's talk about people, swiping artwork from other people and showing it at presentations, and I wasn't there. I don't know about all of that stuff. But what I do know is from my experience on the brand and knowing how Mattel works, ideas are constantly recycled. Ideas are constantly brought back up. Things that are worked on for years but don't go forward or get limited release all the time get released in new colors and in new play patterns because, one, it's a very cost effective, but two, if you have a proven idea, something that works in one toy line, why not do it in another one? Because it's less risky. It absolutely takes a village to create a toy line. I think that Todd McFarlane creating Spawn example is a good example. He created Spawn. One guy. He-Man, not so much. If you look at things like, again, Turok, hero of prehistory, that's not He-Man. And that didn't open the door for Mattel to explore a Barbarian line. Likewise, the He-Man trio is not He-Man. He-Man is not a character who wears military helmets and Boba Fett helmets, but this pitch opened the door to explore a barbarian-themed line. Other people contributing, including marketing and sales, who came up with things like the price point and the scale, absolutely contributed. All of them, it's a mosaic. Everyone came together. Everyone was working in formation. Maybe not everyone willingly, but all of the ideas that were generated by all of these people and all of these companies are what became Masters of the Universe. There's no one creator, but I hope this video sheds some light on how toy making is a collaborative process. And in the end, we got Masters of the Universe. And that's what matters the most. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, pass it along. I'd love for you to share it with your friends. Subscribe, ring the bell, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys around the internet. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.